Towards a Benjaminian environmental historiography, shattering the Anthropocene. I'm Molly Hall. From the proliferation of the zombie apocalypse genre to natural disaster films, images of an atmosphere of crisis saturate our lives through the arts and news media in recent decades. Of those which depict an environmental aesthetic, the cli-fi or climate fiction genre has gained much critical attention of late. Literary critic Dana Phillips recently noted that the eschatological eco-fatalism which pervades contemporary environmental aesthetics and much of the current discourse of environmental politics more generally is being problematically normalized in the depiction of the, quote, strange mutual fate of human cultures and natural environments, explored in a number of such narratives of collapse, end quote. These narratives are almost exclusively set in an era now widely accepted as the Anthropocene. These narratives, in the most recent stage of geological development, are that in which humans are the primary force of geologic change. These narratives, Phillips adds, evince a sense of an ending, risking the foreclosure of sustainable political effectiveness. Such a sense can be felt in Bill McKibben's now classic 1989 environmental text, The End of Nature. Bill McKibben writes, quote, those record highs and record lows that the weathermen are always talking about, they're meaningless now. They imply a connection between past and present which doesn't exist. The comparison, he says, is like hanging Rembrandts next to Warhols. We live in a post-natural world, end quote. This rhetoric has not faded in the intervening decades since McKibben first published these words in 1989. If anything, the paradigm of the Anthropocene, I argue, has insinuated it further into our assumption of its givenness as we perceive the world around us. Phillips reminds us, however, that if so-called environmental degradation ends in the extinction of humanity, quote, it will be a sad day, but it will not be the end of nature, end quote. We might conclude then that the environmental humanities scholars would do well to resist the common urge to look back nostalgically at the good old days, before the split which threw us into an Anthropocene. As I shall argue in this talk, acknowledging the fictional modality of this split is as much of an ecological imperative as recognizing the fiction of the modern, pre-modern split has been for other ethico-historical projects. In order to transform Phillips' critique of narratives of ending into a call for environmental activism for our future, we must now ask how this story of history is formed in the past and maintained in the present. The McKibben passage to which I referred a moment ago and the eschatological thread which Phillips has pulled at within environmental narrative are meant to inspire political action. But have they? In response to their apparent failure, we must ask why, and also ask if this failure can itself be understood as a potential for future success. McKibben's assertion contains several important elements I would like to unpack a little further than Phillips' analysis allows. His comment itself promotes a certain image of history, McKibben's. His object of study is the record containing statistical evidence marking the state of our biosphere and its climate via temperature records. His reading implies not only the end to nature, but within his rhetorical frame he creates, it implies, also an end to history. Records lose meaning. They no longer point to any space on a continuous line, connection, between past and present. His denial of the existential, with doesn't exist, quality of time for humans and for nature performs not only a break, but a locating of the two entities in question on separate parts of a dividing line. Nature comes first, humans come after, hence post-natural. The notion that climate change effectively divorces the past of the human in nature from the present of the post-natural humanity evokes a familiar tendency to posit a temporal break in human history as a break in objective time. In fact, it seems to follow a violent form of periodization which denies continuity of any sort outside of the progress of causality, a progress suspiciously beneficial to the same powers which propagate environmental damage in our world today. This impulse is best exemplified in the body of scholarship which Constantin Fassalt refutes. He explains that historians place all evidence in the context of time, arguing that this is tautological since they have created the temporal distinctions they study. And so, the plodding distinction between a medieval past and a modern present, then, was always a violent imposition on the reality of time. Kathleen Davis adds that the Middle Ages are then, for example, a constructed category which can be applied as a global medieval to any society at any time, not yet achieving modernity or becoming retrograde, usually to post-colonial nations by former colonial powers. In this sense, historical periodization is related to historiographical practices not as an observed objective break in history, then, but in our highly politicized conceptions of it. Dipesh Chakrabarty's early attempt to create historiography of climate change relies on the sort of temporal break critiqued by Fassalt and Davis, a break created by human intervention into the natural limits of our ecosphere as a model for the constitution of modernity, and this modernity as the prerequisite for the designation of the Anthropocene. He states that, quote, the idea of the Anthropocene emerges as the, quote, new geological epoch when humans exist as a geological force, end quote. Chakrabarty concludes that, quote, species may be a placeholder for an emergent new universal history of humans that flashes up in a moment of danger that is climate change, end quote. The title of his essay, The Climate of History, 4 Theses, intentionally echoes historical philosopher Walter Benjamin's radical thinking on human historiography, the Theses on Philosophy of History, which was written in 1940 towards the end of the philosopher's own life. Up against his own historiographical ends, however, Benjamin's original text is hugely different from that propounded by Chakrabarty in 2009. I am suggesting here that Chakrabarty's application of Benjamin's theses oversimplifies the idea most central to his theses, messianic time, that which flashes up in a moment of danger, by calling it universal and stating that it comes from a shared sense of catastrophe. This misrecognition of a strong universal force is due to Chakrabarty's elision of the important form and mode of Benjamin's historiography, one that does not translate into Chakrabarty's work, that of the constellation of images from which the historian, possessing a weak messianic force, may form a new historical possibility, a possible escape from such dangers as those wrought by climate change. These images and the constellation produced through them exist in the now and several newly linked moments of time in the past, and are dependent on an engagement with historical artifacts such as paintings, writings, and statues, and therefore on the privileging of aesthetics and narrative in our approach to this ecological crisis of history in the Anthropocene. This elision occurs, I believe, because Chakrabarty relies heavily on Benjamin's theses out of context of its own historical constellation, ignoring its important relationship to Benjamin's earlier essay, Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. My revisitation of Benjamin's historiography of ethical aesthetics in his theses and Work of Art will, I hope, provide a sense of how reading the two together provide an important framework for the environmental historiography which avoids periodizing violence of rhetorics of the Anthropocene, which themselves participate in discourses supporting rather than resisting the continued degradation of the environment on which our survival depends. A few weeks ago, at a conference titled Climate Change Science in an Age of Misinformation, a panel of experts from various disciplines spoke about the need to reformulate our conception of what causes climate change denialism if we hope to convince enough people to act, individually or collectively, to address environmental concerns. Here, the president of the Union for Concerned Scientists, Kenneth Kimmel, alongside a veteran science journalist, an environmental sociologist, and an environmental philosopher, all said, from the perspective of each discipline, that if facts and reason were going to convince the public now is the time to act, it would have happened decades ago. A different approach is needed. Although Benjamin was loath to dwell on the future, the contemporary political subject is clearly motivated by the imminence of teleological concerns. Whether those motivations lead to political action, paralyzing fear, or systemic denial is not guaranteed, however. Although Benjamin never explicitly theorizes the subject of this reaction, as others have, there is at least an implied subject position in his model of history. We should recall that it is often the subject's orientation towards the environment that is continually questioned, cajoled, and accosted by eco-critics in their readings of both word and world. And so I offer Benjamin's Politics of Possibility, as laid out in his theory of messianic time, as offering hope to the subject imbued with an eschatology of ecological collapse, as an aid to practitioners of historiography who must ask how the historically constituted subject relates, beyond pure intellect and reason, to the temporality of ecology. In his theses on history, the major thrust of Benjamin's philosophies of historical time circulate around a critique of progress and a notion of linear empty homogeneous time that it implies. The traditional historiography views history as flowing in time. This time is external, therefore, to history itself, and hence unaffected by the events and peoples which flow within it. Being uninflected by any contents, Benjamin terms it an empty homogeneous time. This external linear time can be seen in the commonplace notion of progress, the progress which McKibben and Chakrabarty have led us inevitably to our disastrous ecological state. Because progress is a force which transcends history, however, it makes the trajectory of history both unavoidably linear and its progress as such inevitable. In the inevitability of historical progress, all pasts become the inherent predecessor to a predictable future. The danger of this, Benjamin warns us, is that it forecloses the political potentials of history. Benjamin would like to posit a history which resists the traditional story of inevitable progress, which is instead what he calls the, quote, subject of a structure whose site is not homogeneous, empty time, but time filled by the presence of the now, end quote. I would like to encourage environmental humanists to see here the potential for an ecological now, which could become a counterforce to the teleology of the death of nature. We expand Benjamin's reading of progress as a temporality which makes fascism inevitable to the contemporary impetus towards the narrative of ecological collapse. The political foreclosure of possibilities of sustainability is revealed to occur in the same fashion as the foreclosure of liberation from the fascist tradition. Benjamin wants historians to learn to resist this linear progressive time, which tends towards fascism, and to instead embrace an affective political stance motivated by an ethics of happiness. Each artifact of the past, Benjamin believes, tells the story of tradition, but also contains a trace of those on whose unhappiness that tradition was built. Each artifact of the past would then also contain a trace of the possibility of a history, rather than divorced from or transcendent of geology or ecology, could transform our stories of ecological decline into sustainable potentialities. By looking back at the disclusion of images of ecological damage on which we built artistic monuments to our technological victories with an affect of horror, we needn't let the unhappiness this has produced in our present world prevent the foreclosure of a happier ecological trajectory. The environmental temporality evinced by our current focus on the dangerous futures of our continued path, I argue, forces the subject to choose between the annihilation of their way of life or putting faith in hope for salvation through future technological advances. Both affects assume the subjective relation to ecology is to a mourning of something which is not yet dead, or whose death is not yet inevitable, ecology. Both dynamics of environmental affect, the technological salvation and post-natural mourning, produce the same result, political stasis and lack of subjective agency. The recognition by a present now itself in the past now which does not directly precede it, and which is not reflective of the traditional progress narrative, reconstitutes history as a constellation rather than a line. The connection between this present and past now deviates the line of time, thereby demonstrating time's lack of homogeneity and opening up the possibility of redemption from oppression rather than the inevitability of a single outcome, in which power always wins. In this sense, the redrawing of the line of time becomes inseparable from the political possibilities of redemption or failure. When periodizing true or pure nature as before the time of humanity, an idea implicit in the rhetoric of the Anthropocene, the political possibility of the salvation of nature and culture together becomes impossible. Because this recognition occurs in an image of the past, in art as contemplative object, we must look beyond the theses on history to an earlier text. In the work of art, An Age of Mechanical Reproduction, Benjamin explains that through the mechanical reproduction of art, the, quote, quality of its presence is always depreciated, and, quote, its authenticity is interfered with, and that which is, quote, the essence of all that is transmissible from its beginning is no longer directly transmissible. If we can no longer locate the authenticity of art in the object itself, then, he asks, if this disrupts the history art testifies to as well. His answer is yes, and in this disruption a possibility opens up. His argument here is that modern, reproducible art, like the movie or mass-market paperback, inherently deconstructs the lineage of tradition by displacing art from the elite museum wall or prestigious university library, presenting a greater opportunity for the recognition of the missed possibilities of the past, in its being seen out of context, out of time, and also in its being widely available to the public of all classes. If, for example, we can be made to feel the beauty of landscapes no longer present to us through literature, painting, and photography, we can acknowledge that the progress of tradition has been victorious over that physicality, surely, but that our desire to happily inhabit a place such as that, surely not. This is not to be confused purely with a nostalgia, for we can recognize just as easily something of our current unhappiness, forebode in the wasteland of T.S. Eliot's post-World War I trench world, as we can of our soon-to-vanish happiness in the early industrial era's pastoral fields of William Wordsworth's Prelude. In seeing ourselves in both works of art, Benjamin might say that our effective political subject is not tethered to a linear temporality, but rather to a constellation of experiences preserved in works of art. As Benjamin prognosticates, ironically then, in his epilogue to the essay, the logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life. Keeping in mind here still the ironic usage of logical and predicting an inevitability which he will later overtly critique in Theses. Art can, however, through this very failure, thus resulting in fascist aesthetics, encode for future generations the missed possibility presented by artistically rendered horrors of the 30s. He concludes by stating that we should respond to fascist aestheticizing of political violence by politicizing art, and by always seeing in art the potential for a political agency, placed after, both in the sense of the typical Hegelian historical dialectic, the antithesis to fascism's thesis, as well as stylistically after the word fascism, coming in a few sentences later in the text, we can assume that Benjamin hints at the claim he wishes to make on future historians who can look back at the aesthetics of his moment and recognize their own now and redemption. Benjamin himself illustrates a future in his epilogue which both reached back to the past newness of the technological warfare and trenches of World War I and its imperial counterparts, as well as prophetically forward to the horrors of World War II as the aestheticization of mechanized warfare evolved masterfully. We, however, as eco-critical historical materialists, can try to redeem history from the tradition, a tradition of progress in which Benjamin records his failure to prevent in this essay and elsewhere. We can look to the seemingly unnatural metallization of the human body, as he writes in his epilogue, and dystopic flowing of bodies into trenches like the draining of rivers, to the dropping of bombs instead of seeds, and recognize our own ecological now in that past. Rather than see it as the sign that our story must end, as we hear all around us now in ecological collapse, we can see this image as a claim upon us as historical subjects, a claim to look to Benjamin's now, and hopefully see in this constellation not only the horror of the human natural hybridized destruction of his images, but also the inherent imbrication of the human in the natural contained thereto, a knowledge which was increasingly eroded in the linear interval between our two times. We can see this and liberate ourselves from the inevitable causality that it, too, portends if we fail. Thank you.